of students throughout the world that are extraordinary achievers that try to get into Harvard and don't. Getting into Harvard is no easy task for anyone. Every person is the smartest kid in their high school.
You know, it was a very competitive environment.
Yeah.
It was and even, I went into a research position and then applied to the clinical program, which was, even more difficult. I think there were like 400 applications. They interviewed 100 people and they took 6.
Yeah, I was going to say 5 or 6.
So it was, and even when I asked them after I had the research program, they said, you've got great references, a good record, but this is a very competitive program. And so I proceeded to do all kinds of things when I came to America. I entered poetry contests, I entered scientific meeting, abstract award thing. I mean, I did all kinds of things. And so all of a sudden I built up this resume in America. And I have to say, Jonathan Cole was a remarkable man. He picked me up from the airport in Boston, in a Boston winter, which I had never been in. There was a ton of snow. I was wearing loafers. And
you hadn't been to Boston,
and I had not been to Boston. It was, and we get off, and he drops me off at this house of his, which is a massive house in Brookline, Massachusetts, which I did not understand. He said, "Look, I've got a girlfriend in Cambridge. You can stay in this house." And I said, "Well, what? Really?" The pizza guy, every time I ordered pizza, was like, "You live here?" And I thought, kind of. But despite that, in South Africa, we didn't use public transportation because you would probably get murdered, and so
it's a disincentive for using it, actually.
That's right. And so when I came here, and Dr. Cole said, "Well, when do you want to start?" I said, "Well, tomorrow." And he goes, "You just arrived in this country. What do you mean you want to start tomorrow?" I said, "Well, I have nothing to do tomorrow." He said, "No. You take 2 weeks, explore the city, get to know what it is." So there's nothing to explore. I'll explore it on weekends. And he said, "No, you will explore it now. And then you hop on the T," and I was like, "What's the T?" And he goes, "It's the public transport." I was like, "Dr. Cole, I don't use public transportation." Mm-hmm. And he said, "Well, you know what I'll do?" He drove from Cambridge, which was like a 30-minute drive in the morning, to Brookline every morning and took me to the hospital that I worked at until I eventually got a place that was near the hospital, which was a couple weeks later. But, just the generosity, I can't understate the generosity of people I connected with and my good fortune in connecting with people of that caliber. Mm-hmm. And so it made me I was very sentimental and proud of the fact that I could make him proud when I graduated in psychiatry, and I'd done particularly well. And he never went to graduations, and he came to my graduation and he said, "I just had to watch this. I had to watch my investment come to fruition, and I had to pat myself on the back and say, good call."
Yes. You
know me, I'm pretty upbeat and sort of on the happier side of life.
Yes.
And so someone said to me, "You're always so upbeat. Like what?" I said, "Well, it's only because I'm also simultaneously existentially tortured. I'm not. You can't be that happy if you're not also tortured about meaning in life. Mm-hmm. And I think my mother was one of those people who really gave me permission to be that tortured. I had a ton of friends growing up, and I would play with them the whole day, come home, perspiring, ready for my bath. And I would say, "Mama, how come I feel so lonely?" And my brother would say, "You have more friends than God. This is ridiculous. It's not lonely." I said, "No, but I really feel lonely." And she would say, "Darling, sometimes that's how you feel in life."
So now you graduate Harvard. And what is it that you decide to do at this point in the story?
Well, I don't think I've ever, decisions have been always hard for me. Mm-hmm. Because I throw myself into things, and I want to know a lot about different things, and I want to make connections. Mm-hmm. So when I graduated, in terms of preferences, I could have done anything. Mm-hmm. But I was very lucky to have Bruce Cohen, who was my mentor and was the head of the residency program and became the head of the hospital subsequently. And he called me and he said, "Srini, what do you want to do?" I said, "Bruce, you know me. I could do anything. I could do psychotherapy. I could do pharmacology. I could do brain imaging," which is what I was doing at the time. And he essentially offered me a position to start and develop the outpatient anxiety disorders program. So that was my clinical job. I had a private practice, and I continued my work in brain imaging.
So then take us on the next piece of the story. What becomes of you next?
So I do this brain imaging research. I'm still unsure what I want to do. My mentors are saying
Now you're
to me,
doing brain imaging research at a time in which there is extraordinary growth in the field and knowledge. 50 years ago, we're not able to look at the human brain to the degree that we are today. Today we've mapped it out pretty well. And so you were doing work at a time in which the field was really
well, it was
expanding.
Evolving, but
Quickly.
it was right at the beginning though. Because when I wanted to do this, the reason I did it was because so Jonathan Cole, when I was working for him, I came from South Africa, immigrant, I had to prove myself. So every time he gave me a project, I finished it. And so eventually he called me to his office and he said, I'm not going to be able to keep you if you keep doing these projects so quickly. I said, but I thought you want them to be done. He said, yeah, but you're doing them at such a rapid rate, I'm not going to have stuff to give you. And eventually he called me and he said, you've basically finished the entire year's work that I wanted you to do in a couple months. Is there something else in the hospital that you're interested in? And I said, yeah, I want to understand brains. I want to know what's going on in the structure and function of brains. And I eventually went over to the Brain Imaging Center, which had just started. And when I went there, Perry Renshaw was there, and he said, well, what can I do for you? And I said, is there a project I can get engaged in? He said, well, we're not actually doing anything, but I'll tell you what, you know something about the brain. Here's an engineer. She knows about computers. Why don't you guys talk about what you want to do, and we can figure out a way to program the software to look at the brain region. So it was at that point, there was nothing established.
Right.
So I sat with Christina, we figured it out together. We used the software to measure brain functions. I think it was the second paper of its kind in depression. So it was very early that I started to look at this. But at the same time, my mentors were saying, you've got to drop your clinical work. And I was like, no, I don't want to drop my clinical work. And so I did this job, which was a close to full-time research position and clinical work at the same time. And I think the point about this is that it never made sense for me to be the way that I was being. It still doesn't make sense for me to be the way that I'm being in global terms. But I don't know how to live my life in a way that's separate from my gut and separate from the things that energize me. And I think there are a lot of people who've done a lot more research and been much more successful than I have in getting grants. And there are a lot of people who've done a lot more clinical work. But there are not a ton of people who've done that depth of clinical work and that depth of brain research who are in a position to be able to make those connections for the general public. And that's, it's a pretty cool position to be in, to be able to translate the complexity of what goes on in the lab to people so they can understand how they can change their brains.
I want to talk about how you begin the idea that becomes the basis of the book that we're going to talk about. Where does this first begin for you?
The idea probably started from birth, meaning I was never able, I loved music as much as I loved math, as much as I loved, languages. So, and I saw that there was a distinct advantage to thinking across different fields. But literally, Celeste Fine, who was my book agent, sat with me for an hour and said, okay, you're going to write a book. That's great. Let's figure out what it's going to be about. I want you to talk
Generally
to me.
a good idea when you're writing a book.
Right. And so she says, just talk to me for an hour and let's see what comes out of your mouth. And so I told her about everything that I cared about, and I care about this and I care about that. And she said, okay, so you are successful at being unfocused. So you know how to be a brain researcher and a psychiatrist and an executive coach and work with companies and work with patients and be interested in technology and in music and produce along every one of those lines. And somehow your life feels more efficient that way. Maybe people are missing the point about doing multiple things. Most people think they're going to exhaust themselves.
Oh, right, exactly.
But if you find a way to connect them, like I am currently, all of a sudden it actually halves your work to be able to think about music and technology at the same time. When would study music, there was a time when I wrote musical composition purely from understanding mathematical intervals, because I was lazy to pitch the notes. But I knew the mathematical intervals were like 3 up, 2 down, 4 up, 3 down, 2 down, and I knew what it sounded like. It actually makes your work much easier. But I think when I talked to Celeste about this and I said I wanted to do this, she said, why don't you write a book about unfocus and see if we can help people understand that there are distinct disadvantages to focusing.